If you're old enough to remember when phones had cords and the only thing that went viral was a cold, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the Big 6-0 with Kaylee Harris and Guy Rawlison. Because who better to discuss life's second act than two people who still think mature is a type of cheese?
Welcome to the Big 6-0 podcast this week. My name is Kaylee and co-hosting the show with me each week is my friend Guy Rawlison, who I first met in primary school around 50 years ago. Guy, I can't believe I'm saying that 50 years ago. Guy, welcome.
Thanks, Kaylee. 50 years, gosh. I mean, that's half the world's
We're that
current
old.
population's been born since then.
That's right. Now, we've had an amazing range of guests on the podcast so far, from 70s pop stars to movie experts. Adventurer Michelle Lee was on, newsreader Tim Webster, and a stack of other really fascinating people. This week, we wanted to turn the podcast over to equally fascinating people who aren't necessarily celebrities or experts in their field, ordinary people who have extraordinary stories to tell. And that, I reckon, is all of us. Now, like Guy, I've known our next guest for a long time, about 30 years. Ben Roberts and I started working together at a radio station in Sydney, I think around 1990, but he'll correct me if that's wrong. There was a group of us who worked there who loved to go out and party and stuff like that, obviously before we all had kids. And I remember one night we went out dressed up as the cast from the Thunderbirds to a special screening of the show at a theatre in Sydney. Welcome, Ben, and do you remember that night?
Oh, how could I ever forget it? Especially seeing as I made all the costumes.
Yes, you did.
Yeah.
Which Thunderbird were you?
I don't know. Everybody wanted to be Virgil, and it just wasn't possible, like within the cast. And also, I mean, they only made the uniforms that covered the actual pilots. So, Tintin missed out, nobody was Brains, I don't think. Yeah, it was a bit lopsided from that, but everybody knew who we were.
They certainly did. Now, Ben, you reached out to us a few weeks ago about coming onto the podcast and talking about your unique story, and it's a diagnosis that you received later on in life. What was that diagnosis and when did you get it?
It was around 60 and I was diagnosed as having ADHD.
Okay, so I guess the first question, how did that make you feel? Did it answer a lot of your questions or were you shocked? How did you feel?
Yeah, it was mixed feelings at the time. I really, for my part, it's difficult to observe yourself from outside. You do have, everybody's got their personality quirks and they've got their particular persona and habits and so forth. But what I probably knew about myself was that a lot of the things I did I personally found quite frustrating, and it wasn't something that I could internally analyze. I noticed things, I noticed patterns happening, but I just didn't seem to be able to do anything about them. And getting the ADHD diagnosis was a relief in a lot of ways because I suddenly had some answers. I suddenly had some way of analysing how I behave and the things that I do, and it stopped being a mystery.
Yeah, because as kids, Ben, I mean, there were a lot of things that weren't on our parents' radar or our radar, and it may have been, Kaylee's always an active participant in class discussions, or Guy could channel his enthusiasm into his tasks and could achieve a whole lot more. What were the signs that now present themselves that you wouldn't have been aware of back in the day, but it all makes sense now?
I guess one of the things that was very consistent was the school reports, and they always went along the lines of, Ben is a very intelligent young man, but he could try harder. He could concentrate more. These kind of issues kept coming up. And my mother was not an unintelligent person. She was actually a comedy writer, and she discovered that I was getting these consistent reports which were seeming to say, I mean, to her, it was saying there's something wrong. And she did actually take me to get assessed by some sort of professional. I don't know who they were or, what the letters behind their names were. And I remember doing these tests with them and so forth. But the outcome of that seemed to be diddly squat. And actually, I've heard this from other people now because, I now have, sort of an ADHD community. But I've heard from other people that, that band of time or that era of time was just was this sort of moment in time where I think the condition was starting to be recognised, but not fully understood. I don't know that it even had a name then. So people my age, missed out on getting any kind of treatment, if there was indeed any available, simply because we didn't fit into a category.
I think that we all knew, as Guy said, we all knew kids at school who couldn't sit still, who were very, very active. Was that what your early education was like? What was a young Ben Roberts like in primary school and high school?
Well, in primary school, I was good at some things and definitely not good at others. I loved creative writing, for example. I loved art. I struggled with mathematics, and that kind of became my, my ogre in primary school. That just dogged me, the whole way through, and sort of ignominy that went with not being able to keep up even a bit, really, with mathematics. It caused all sorts of, unpleasant singling out for me. So what would happen is that where a kid's not keeping up, that'll often turn into like a behaviour problem. So, I became a bit of a class clown, and my, sort of primary goal was to make people laugh. Once I'd sort of established myself as being a bit of a disturbing influence, sometimes I got moved around the classroom, but then I'd just get to work on the next table full of kids and see if I could get them to laugh. So that carried through to high school as well.
So you sort of took this persona of being the class clown or whatever. What was your own self perception of your life and your place as far as why is this happening? Why was there a self perception?
No, not really. No, it made me happy to make people laugh. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. Obviously, the teachers did. And I guess to a certain extent, I was in a situation where, they say misery loves company. So maybe ADHD likes the company of other distracted kids. Might be the situation.
Moving on to you talked about tertiary education. When you left high school, did you feel as though your options were limited in terms of career because of the issues you were having?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, you're smart. Why didn't you go to university?" And inside me, I knew that I wouldn't be able to do it. I knew I wouldn't be able to do work the way it's supposed to be done, which is largely unsupervised, if you like. ADHD people work better with being managed and having deadlines. So if you take both those things away, we tend to drift, and we certainly don't do what we're supposed to do when we're supposed to do it. If I had to study for something, it'd be like, yeah, I could study for it today, but I could do it tomorrow as well. And yeah, I'll do that. So you just keep putting it off. What would generally happen if I had to study for an exam or something like that is that I'd have to, I would end up cramming at the last minute. And I mean, I did go to TAFE and I did do a trade course, and I did electronic engineering. It was supposed to be, but the electronic engineering course brought me to my limit as far as how I could perform in an education environment. And I've learnt since that that's quite common with ADHD. You can perform well in primary school, you can go okay in high school because you're still being managed, but then in tertiary education environment, particularly university, the expression was used, you will pancake. And I knew before I even tried that would probably be the outcome if I'd gone to university. So as far as getting my first job, my uncle had a contact with a radio station in Wollongong, and so I got offered a couple of weeks' work experience at the radio station, and I ended up getting on really well with the chief engineer. I mean, that started me off in something, and the way the sort of economy was at the time, and the way the employment situation was in Wollongong at the time, I thought, well, this is the best bet I've got. So I grabbed it with both hands, and I actually signed up for my TAFE course before they even offered me a traineeship. So I guess I'm not sure how limited my options would have been had I not had that opportunity. If I'd had to go out into the big bad world with my HSC score, I probably would have got, a lot more laughs. It was nothing to write home about.
This episode of the Big 60 brought to you by Louis Carr Real Estate, helping people in the Hills District find their dream home since 1992. Ready to buy, sell, or rent? Check out louiscarr.com.au for all your property needs.
You talked before about your mum and how you thought in school she knew something was up. Let's move ahead now to when you get to your teenage years and your early 20s and stuff like that. How did this impact on your relationships when you look at it now and with the benefit of hindsight?
I was thinking about it earlier on today, and I think I've always called myself a late bloomer because, I never really had a girlfriend till I was, I think, in my early 20s. And I think one of the reasons for that is because I don't read people very well. I don't, particularly females, I don't, like if you're expecting flowers on Valentine's Day, expect to be disappointed. If you're expecting me to make you lunch, then expect to be disappointed.
Was that because you just didn't think of it, or why was that?
Yeah, this is the problem.
Didn't think of it, didn't care, didn't like the girl that much.
No, I think it's like it's one of the effects of this type of neurodivergence where if I was thinking about lunch, for example, I might just think, I'm hungry, I need to eat something, and I'm going to make some lunch. The fact that somebody else was there didn't really come into the equation. You tend to go down this narrow focus route, and it's not till somebody comes along and says, "Oh, did you make me a sandwich?" And it just goes, "Oh, no, I didn't." And up to that point, never occurred to me. So from a relationship perspective, I'd have to really try. If I was gonna pull off anything romantic, I'd have to really plan ahead. And what'd be a real killer for me is if it didn't work out, because then that'd probably sort of put me off doing it again.
So just having a look at your situation as a husband, and what prompted you to decide, I might go and get something diagnosed later in life, and how do you feel when you received sort of that validation that, oh, hang on, there is actually a reason behind all this?
Oh yeah, it's I got to say when I got the assessment, it hit me as a wave of depression, but it was over pretty quick. It was like getting dumped down at the beach by a wave, and I sort of got ducked under the water, and then I came up again, and it didn't last long, that feeling of if only I'd known, because if I looked back at how my life had been, first of all, I wouldn't have known where to go or what to do, or if there even was such a thing. Second of all, I hadn't really put together any of the pieces to say I need to get an assessment. In fact, I owe it all to my wife that she said to me, "Oh, there's this really good episode of Insight on SBS about adult ADHD. I think you might get something out of it." And I sat down and watched it, and it was like meeting my tribe. He was all these people with the same problems that I have had, and the same inability to plan things, inability to deal with money, inability to be normal.
I think there's a lot of talk around about how many kids these days are being diagnosed with ADHD, and the concern that children are maybe being put on drugs like Ritalin too quickly, and there seems to be a whole stack of kids out there now taking that drug, whereas you have got to this stage in your life, to 60, and you seem to have been okay through your life without taking those drugs. Are you on medication now, Ben?
Yeah, yeah. I'm taking Ritalin now, and once again, the effect is difficult to put into words. But what I noticed with the medication was that it allowed me to be more present. With no medication, I can be in the room but not present quite easily. And that happened a lot. And looking back on it, that happened with my kids. I could be in the room with my kids and not present at all, because the one thing I've noticed that the Ritalin does for me is it really calms down the inner monologue. So instead of having this continuous thought process, I've suddenly went, oh, it's not there. And it's difficult, I think, for people outside of my brain. Nobody can see that that's what was going on before. Now it's not going on, but it makes a profound difference to your state of being, that you haven't got this continuous pointless thought process going on, which is constantly talking to you. So that's probably the biggest effect of basically taking speed.
Did you, Ben, have a perception prior to the diagnosis of what you thought ADHD was? And has your understanding of that changed since then?
Oh yeah, massively. I remember meeting this guy once who was just obnoxious in the extreme. He was unpleasant, always agitated, always seemed like he was spoiling for a fight. And I thought to myself, you know what? This is an ADHD kid grown up. And in addition to that, I, as well as many other people, had this perception that ADHD is a kid thing. And when I went to do my assessment, I had to sit in a little office with, little pictures of Hello Kitty on the wall and stuff like that. I was sitting at a little kitty desk doing my assessment because the psychologist's room was set up for assessing children. So, yeah, it made a very big difference to my perception of ADHD as a condition. And, well, to find out that I had it when I thought that prior to that, ADHD was for out of control lunatic kids, that were climbing up the walls and throwing stuff out the windows. Yeah, it was. Yes, I've got a much more tolerant view of ADHD people now.
Just finally, Ben, before we wrap it up, you talked in the very beginning about finding and discovering an ADHD community. Are you part of some sort of support group, or what does that community mean to you, or what does it look like?
Yeah, I've participated in like an online community. I don't do it regularly. I did just after the assessment. Strangely enough, also, there's a car forum that I've been a member of for many, many years, and a thread got started on that about ADHD. because one of the members also got assessed late in life and was diagnosed. That turned out to be, quite a good experience because it actually brought more members out of the closet, if you like, and we had a good discussion. We had a good exchange of ideas and experiences, which I definitely think it's enormously helpful after you've been diagnosed to realise that you're not on your own.
One thing I want to know is, do you have an ADHD superpower, whether that's creative thinking, hyperfocus, or perhaps turning anything into a drumstick during a business meeting or whatever?
Yeah, I think, well, the hyperfocus, I would say, is the, that's the superpower if there is one. The downside to that, and in some respects, I've always said, if I'd been autistic, then I might be able to, play the piano like Mozart or something like that, where I've actually never been able to learn a musical instrument because I just won't practice and I just won't stick to it. And hyperfocus is the superpower. It's got a downside, which is that when that thing that you're hyperfocusing on loses novelty, it's a throwaway. You just don't go back to it, and it's to a certain extent, I've sort of thought that ADHD is a bit of a booby prize when it comes to superpowers. But by the same token, what I find is that hyperfocusing, if I can hyperfocus on something long enough to finish it, I can probably do it faster than somebody else can. So it's something that, I'd say if you get diagnosed earlier than I did, and you can avoid forming habits, the kind of habits that I've formed, then there's probably a better chance of you using it as a superpower.
Ben, I appreciate your time. Both Kaylee and I probably didn't have the insights that you've been able to afford, let alone everyone that's listening at the moment. And it probably gives us a much clearer picture as to why people like some of us probably could have achieved a whole lot more at school if we hadn't have been that class clown, or if we just had have got that report card that resonated with maybe our parents that, didn't quite understand what it meant by saying if you directed your focus, you could achieve a whole lot more.
Well, indeed, yes. Some of us are in a different spot to others, but I hope that, what I've been able to pass on here in the podcast, if somebody hears it and they think that, that might be them or it's their child, and they recognise some of these outcomes and characteristics, that they might consider getting themselves or somebody close to them an assessment.
Ben Roberts, thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
The views and opinions expressed on the Big 6-0 are personal and reflect those of the hosts and guests. They do not represent the views or positions of any affiliated organisations or companies. This podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Please consult with a qualified professional for guidance on any personal matters.
Oh, and before we go, let's give credit where credit is due. Kaylee Harris and I came up with all the genius content for this week's episode. Our producer, Nick Abood, well, he keeps the lights on and makes sure we don't accidentally upload a cat video instead of a podcast. So thanks for keeping us on track, Nick. Nick?